It's okay. As we start recording, for the people that are watching the recording, for people that are watching the recording, a quick sort of recap. I gave sort of my life story and lead up and some of the stuff that I won't be talking about today. But a little bit narrowing down the scope of what I will be talking about moving forward is a few sort of guiding questions motivating my research. And so one is, what do we mean when we use SES, race and ethnicity, as proxies in neuroscience research? And then they're both just as difficult. How do we think about measuring and modeling these complex structural and environmental features, particularly as it means, so there are all these complex dynamics. How do we then sort of bring it into the sort of quantitative realm of neuroscience and psychology? So those are the two questions. So first chunk, and I'll speed through some things. I feel like, one, I get overexcited, and two, I feel like I have so many things that I could be talking about. So I might be jumping ahead a few slides at some point. But sort of talk about sort of the first category of things. So another thing to sort of throw in as I sort of think about environmental exposures, environmental context, social determinants of health, is sort of thinking about how things are, again, instead of taking a more person-centric approach with, if you remember the image with concentric circles, is actually thinking a bit more of a person kind of in the context of sort of society. So drawing from what some call the sociological imagination, but really thinking about sort of this hierarchical sort of structure in which now the processes, the structural and sociological sort of mechanisms that impact individuals are those are kind of placed at the forefront. And so here's just a chart that I like to use for my dissertation. I'm trying to get this in some sort of publication so I can then use that. But essentially sort of thinking how individuals, there may be processes in a study or a study sort of system in which things are operating at micro scale for individuals. There could be biological and psychological factors. There could be meso, sort of in between sort of elements related to neighborhoods that could have built environments and social environments, but really thinking also about these macro scale sort of factors that may be playing out. And these could be things related to sociocultural context, political context, economic context, and really trying to think about as much as possible about that context as well, and how it occurs in our studies. And so, and I use this sort of macro, meso, micro scale to sort of think about how upstream sort of elements like as we were talking about EPA, who is president, right? Like what administration is happening, right? And like how that could have very large impacts on, things that may be happening at neighborhood level, the way that data are collected and stored and accessed, and which could then also impact not just individuals, but the way that we as researchers are able to conduct studies or analyses related to these microscale sort of features. So a lot of it is sort of like definitional sort of elements. So I guess another thing that I should mention here is that for the stuff that I'm talking about, some people may talk about things like race and socioeconomic status as sort of things that may be operating at an individual level, but I actually place them at a macro scale level. And I actually think that those factors can be measured as at an individual level, but they actually represent sort of the sort of cumulative might not even be the right one, but in some certain way, a cumulative sort of element of dynamics that are happening at all of these different scales. So just a clarification here, whenever I'm talking about race and ethnicity, again, I'm not talking about an individual trait, but more so racialization. So what are all of the sociocultural and political process through which people are raced? And how are these responsible for how and why belonging to a particular sort of ethnic or racial group then has sort of some implications and connections to different processes. So bottom line, it's not that we're measuring and looking at in race, but we're really looking at sort of racism and the structural dynamics we're in. Same thing can be said about socioeconomic status, even household income and educational attainment. These are markers of social class. And what is social class? Again, it's sort of this abstract sort of thing that is given meaning, right, by the context of society, even things that are relational in nature, like poverty lines are relative numbers depending on inflation, things like that. Who is the 1%, right? Like that 1%, when people talk about the 1%, could dynamically be changing and be subject to a number of things. But again, that that dimension and that spectrum is created by sociocultural forces. It's like when people are like, if we got rid of currency, right? Like you may still see some of these social class sort of elements, but it would probably change shape, right? We would use some other sort of measurable to maybe approximate some of these more abstract sort of elements. So as I'm throwing out our definitions and all these things, so starting from grad school, actually, so trained as a neuroscientist, social neuroscientist, cognitive neuroscientist, environmental neuroscientist, whatever you want to call it, thinking about all these things, sort of my sort of home base is thinking about how does this impact people and the brain and how the brain works, right? And so in looking for different data sets that allowed me to sort of look at a number of these different elements all together, I found the ABCD study. And so the ABCD, do people know what the ABCD study is?
I know too much.
Too much, okay. So ABCD study, so and actually more recently, and this is actually where Lucina and I met, right? It's like one of the things about it is that because the study is so big, it's really great that it has all these different things, right? But it's also something that can be used by so many people. Literally anyone that fills out this agreement can go, and then once you get the data, you can write up and publish or try to publish anything you want. And so one really big thing that has kind of sort of melded now, sort of as part of my research, or I feel like I've grown into, is as being part of the ABCD study is thinking a lot about these constructs and how we measure them, how we communicate about them. ABCD, and I knew it as something else. I knew it as something else, which was like I think it was like the name of like a cognitive measurement or something. And so ABCD is just that's really funny.
You've never heard that?
No.
So for people who come from South Asia, you have people like me who like grew up in the US, and so you have like the fresh off the boats, or like Priyanka is like fresh off the boat.
Yeah.
Right? You have me as like an American, I'm not American born, but anyway, ABCD is like an American born confused entity because you haven't heard this before?
No, I've never heard that one, but like the concept, like in Mexican Americans, like there's a number of ones, right? Like there's like for example, like pochos, which is like the one where it's like if you're Mexican American, or I mean, you could be Mexican in any sort of flavor, but like you can't really speak you speak Spanish with a heavy English accent. Yeah. And so like there's different words, or like I think they call them now like the Yosaba, which is a joke about like a verb that gets conjugated in a particular confusing way. So I didn't know ABCD, but yeah, no, it's like it doesn't surprise me. I feel like there's always like yeah. So in thinking about, so there's a lot of so that's been sort of another sort of big part that I think is also which has also been it's been a good place to have a lot of these discussions because there are large implications for having such a big study. And so it becomes really important to talk about these issues, but also it's been a really good sort of platforming catalyst for sort of informing a lot of the questions that I ask myself and sort of how that sort of develops. And in some ways, how did that develop into sort of publications, right? And so, there's a number of papers kind of talking about responsible use in different sorts of ways, which you can read. But I did want to chat about sort of a couple of things that, which Andrew, I'm glad that you're on the call because you'll appreciate some of these updates on sort of the working group 3 paper. But one of the current sort of projects that I'm working on is alongside Maribel Gonzalez Robledo, who is no longer a postdoc. I forget her official title. I think she's like research scientist over at UCSD. Something fancier, and it means that she can be PI on grants now, is what I know. Yeah, like they're like, you need a different name. Like it's like after 6, it's like something else. And so yeah, maybe a project scientist. I forget what UCSD does in that case. But so one of the things that, and a lot of this is sort of fueled, but as a result of sort of these responsible use and communication of conversations, right? We're working on a paper sort of working on recommendations related to responsible use and communication of race and ethnicity in neuroscience. And so Lucina and Andrew actually is a chair, is one of the co-chairs for the working group where a lot of these conversations have happened. And so that's something that we're working on. And so this will be new for everybody on working group 3, but one of the things is that so I found this, so it's not a surprise that people have had these conversations for a while. And so the sort of the plan we've been working on this paper for so long is to essentially think, so what happened at some point is that this group of people, a number of people in Europe basically got together and said, we all care about ethnicity and it's important for health. We all care about health equity. However, we're all over the place, even though we care, we're all over the place in terms of like how we want to approach it and how we want to prioritize things. Can we work on some sort of statement that we can all sort of follow, right? And so what they did is through a particular sort of like a participatory process, and I have the citation there if you're interested in reading on this, a number of experts kind of got together and put forth these Leeds consensus principles for research on ethnicity and health. And I think these, I won't read through all of them. I can send along the link for the paper, but essentially a lot of these things are recommendations for kind of like a value statement, if you will, but a number of statements also that that researchers should follow, especially in sort of the health sciences broadly, in thinking about ethnicity, right? So from there, it's basically like what our paper sort of looks like right now is an implementation of what this might look like in sort of developmental cognitive neuroscience. And so, some of the recommendations of, so without going through down all of that list, even though that would be useful, but I do want to talk about some other things too. Some of our recommendations, right, is just that researchers should think about ethnicity is important, and it has implications for health across the board, no matter where you go. And so researchers should think about and communicate how they are operationalizing and coding race and ethnicity in their papers. So whenever people are sort of controlling for race and ethnicity, it's always asking, well, what do you mean by that? And also communicating sort of the frameworks in which people are sort of contextualizing these different sorts of effects. This is drawing from some other sort of work, but Nancy Krieger has talked often about sort of this double-edged sword that happens with ethnicity, where it's important to characterize what the makeup of your population looks like in your research, because it could be important in terms of uncovering sort of health disparities or whatnot. But there's this double-edged sword where the moment that you make that data available, it also means that the participants and the groups are now vulnerable. And so how to think about maximizing sort of the transparency of what the group might of what your population might look like, while also being attentive to this to the vulnerability of that population in being identified. And so to kind of mitigate some of these potential sort of problematic sort of statements or stigmatizing or things like that, there's a number of things that I think that we talk about, and that some of these other papers sort of talk about. Spoiler, it's always complicated, it depends on your study. But I think the biggest sort of helpful thing here is just race and ethnicity can mean so many things. Same thing with socioeconomic status. It can mean so many things. And so always trying to be as clear as possible what that necessarily means is sort of the most important thing that can happen there. Some other things too that are a little that we hammer home a bit more than sort of these Leeds consensus principles is acknowledging that these are socially constructed concepts that are continuously being sort of reinforced. And so so again, as I was sort of saying before, there's sort of if we think about what it means in a study or for someone to indicate their race or ethnicity or social class, it's, even though it's an individual sort of measurement and self-reported, it is sort of it is also a bit of a snapshot of all the existing sort of social dynamics at the time. Social constructed doesn't mean that people can make it up however they want. It just means that it is sort of it is sort of like an emergent property of all these social dynamics.
What's interesting to me is that if you go to different people across the globe, they also don't always agree on the use of these terms. Like, first of all, the term race, right? When I use that in a document for OHBM, which is a global organization, the Europeans and the people from South America were like, oh, we don't use race as a diversity variable, we use ethnicity, because like they think of race as like an American thing. Like Americans use race to describe these things. We don't do that. And so like all the code of conduct stuff for OHBM was written in a slightly different language than the same kind of diversity statement code of conduct that I write for American organization. I think it gets into these really complicated discussions about like if you say there's something called race, then it exists, but if you never use it, then it's just not a way that that part of the world thinks. So I just found it really interesting that even just like you're just saying race and ethnicity here, but in all the OHBM documents, we switched to just saying ethnicity and not race because that was too America-centric.
Yeah, no, yeah, actually, so actually going back to the Leeds consensus statement, so the paper, it's a consensus statement because literally what the way that the process was that they had all these experts, and then the experts are basically like, here are all the things that we can think of, and then they kind of like workshopped it to add more elements, and then and at a later round, all the experts kind of took all of the statements that emerged, and then they all sort of like ranked them in terms of like their endorsement, but also well, so they they ranked them, but they also like endorsed each of the statements, and so they basically took like the top 10, but there's like 30 of them, and interestingly it only says ethnicity, so it doesn't say
race, right?
and the ones, a lot of the ones that did not make it were things that were saying things that were like acknowledging structural racism or like systemic sort of elements that may be related to racial discrimination, and those like were not endorsed super highly. I mean, they still came out of the sort of focus groups as being important, but they weren't part of the consensus. And so that, yeah, I can definitely sort of see that about how like it can be seen as a sort of US centric sort of element. Yeah.
One of the reviewers came back and said that like previous paper only used race for like ABCD studies, whatnot. So I was wondering like what's your usual practice for putting race and ethnicity as variables in the models? Do you put them like put both of them in the model, have you used one or both?
So I think as long as you like justify it, as long as you like justify it and like go strong, right? Like I think that's like I think it'll just depend, because so specifically using ABCD data, it's tricky because race and ethnicity are not exactly the same and they're different. But that's where it does get tricky in terms of like the fact that it's self-reported, is that as you sort of start thinking about the self-reported, you know, I think especially for ABCD, like if you look at both the race and ethnicity sort of constructs together, that it seems like a combined sort of race, ethno-racial sort of construct may actually be what people were thinking about when they were sort of filling it out. So the way that you sort of see it is that like, you know, people that are Hispanic could be any race, right? But like people that indicate that they're Hispanic, a lot of them will indicate don't know, none for race, or like other sort of elements. And so it's like, so in some ways, sometimes that if you look at them separately, the data doesn't quite sort of make sense. Like there's a lot of sort of discordant sort of responses, but if you combine them sort of together, it like there is like it does kind of match a little bit of what people would say. So it's tricky because it's not, they're different constructs, but people may be sort of you know, using them in a combined sort of manner, right? And so I think my response for paper is just I think in the method section, just always saying like we're using this variable, which represents, like if you're using the race underscore ethnicity, a variable in ABCD is just saying the race underscore ethnicity variable is a combined ethno-racial construct, and then what I like to do also, and there could be statistical considerations for why you combine categories together, right? Is just saying here are all the categories on what people filled out, and here's what we sort of put together, right? And so, because I think there isn't going to be like a perfect answer, and so yeah, so it gets really tricky with reviewers because reviewers will have their own schemas about race and ethnicity. And
well, they might not be very informed at all. So that's the problem. I mean, in fact, they're probably less informed than you about this.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's particularly annoying because you probably have to appease the reviewer on the one hand, but they probably have no idea what they're talking about as far as, you know.
Yeah, well, and another thing that we talk about too is like, do you need to include race and ethnicity? And there could be a lot of statistical considerations for like, again, because SES, a lot of things go with SES too. It's like SES, race and ethnicity. So many of these are proxies, right? And so like in many ways, they might actually be mediated, like there might be an underlying process that's unmeasured or something like that, but like people want to stick to those, right? And actually, like there are ways in which including race and ethnicity, if you're looking at neighborhood sort of effects, could actually like mess up your causal models, right? But you know, some people like just want, so that's another thing that's just more like the sociology of science, right? That just like people will be like, control for race and ethnicity, and you're like, no, but it makes no sense. Like it means like I'm tossing out everything that's related to my effect, you know. So yeah, it's yeah.
When you measure this, do you push choice? Does it matter?
It does matter. So So it does matter. So it does matter. And so it's because they're different processes, right? So like if you do, it's you can call it in like open, closed, or closed. It's like a it's like a open system statements and closed system statements. So like if somebody fills out if you ask someone to fill out the census, right? They may answer differently than if I say, do you mind just writing down with no options, what is your racial and ethnic identity, right? And so like those are different sort of processes, like where someone categorizes themselves versus where they might see themselves. I mean, there could be overlaps, but there may not necessarily, right? And so I think in communicating, in sort of communicating and using that in your methods, I think it's important to sort of be clear about which one it is. And I would always sort of say that, like, the ethnic identity, the racial and ethnic identity sort of measures are should be a bit more dynamic if that really is the question in mind, than sort of like self-reported race and ethnicity. Like, I think that might be I would put them as like different sort of marker, like slightly different, closely related, but sort of different sort of constructs.
Because in my memory, we always ask, are you Hispanic? And then are you white?
No, yeah, well, no, and so I'm working on it's been really helpful. I've been collaborating with some people in our department, sort of looking at they're looking at the onset of MS. And so I'm sort of the collaborator that looks at like neighborhood effects, but it's on Hispanic Latinx cohorts. And so they have a group from LA, they have a cohort from Miami, and they have a cohort from Puerto Rico. And so it is even interesting that they had to select that they were sort of Hispanic to be part of the study, right? But even within that, right, if you start to look at the sort of racial choices, then looking at like self-identification and like where they place it, like they're not exactly on, like, there's also like, there's other sort of like dynamics, like there's also different sorts of dynamics within it, right? Like, so yeah, it's much more complex. And like, I think there were some people that were talking about how, like, I actually don't know what those data look like now, but at some point it was like, where it gets really tricky, really difficult, and is when you're thinking about people that are multiracial or multi-ethnic, because then that's really where you're like, well, like, what do I put down? Because it is going to be a combination of like, what is most salient to me, but like technically, like if people are like, I'm technically like half this and half that, but I feel more this, or am I? And I think there was some data about how like people that were like half white, half Hispanic, as they would sort of describe it, right? How some people would like stop saying they were Hispanic for a while. And then so like, because there really is just this ambiguity there. And it's hard because sometimes you don't know. It's like some of it is like closeness, centrality, how important your identity is to you, obviously interacts with what you might put down, right? And we don't know because people are putting down they like.
I think it changed depending on where you live. Like my identity became salient when I went to college. It wasn't before, because
Yeah.
it's happened in your life that make you realize you're racialized a certain way.
Yeah, no, it's I mean, talk about sort of individual experiences. Like I remember when I applied to college, because I grew up in South San Diego, and I remember like there was this big thing that we were like, oh, do we, like when you're applying to college, we're like, do you want to indicate that you're Hispanic or Latino? Like, I don't want to just like, you have that, like we talked a lot about it. And even now, like I was helping some people apply to college now for my like home neighborhood, and they were like, I don't know if I want to do that. Like, I don't want them to think that I just got it because of all these things. But now I'm kind of like, check the box. Yeah, like I'm like, check the box and do it, right? So there's also like, and I think that's another thing. It's like even internalized notions, right? Like within an individual, right? Internalized notions, or like, internalized racism, or it interacts with sort of this. That's funny. I usually have a table sort of describing these things, but it's like internalized sort of elements. Internalized racism can interact with the way that you self-report these categories, which also interacts with your actual sort of like identity, right? So it's very sort of complex, and we don't know. Just like people are like, again, as with other things, right? There's all sorts of measurement error, and so as because sort of people sort of take it for granted, right? They're like, oh, these are. I also have a slide usually when people are like, oh, these categories are fixed, and it's like the census literally changes them like every like 10 years, depending on what questions or categorizations are important. So like these things are always changing. And so what does that mean for, even though we think of sort of like data, we think of data and the analyses that we're doing, right, as sort of like timeless, right? Because we're looking at, even in basic psychology or neuroscience, right? Like we're finding the way that this sort of works. And then you're kind of like, well, but if you're thinking about any of these things, you're already sort of you're already sort of embedding sort of these social things. I always laugh when people are like, "Oh, science is not political," and I'm like, "Well, I mean, it's you literally you use these and you ask these questions, and so you made it political. I mean, not by choice, but like it's a part of it. So
It informs policy.
yeah, so. But anyway, so just other things that from this paper too, we're also working on sort of because some people like broader questions, right? Some people like more specific sort of things, and so along with Maribel, we're working on some specific sort of guidelines. This is sort of just like the first and last pages of just really thinking about stepping through the research process. What are some things? These are all the questions that don't let me sleep at night or like make me paralyzed with like any sort of study I do, but I share them with everybody. I share my paralyzing anxiety with everybody. Things about conclusions and implications, right? Things that you can ask yourself as you're sort of writing. Like, and I think that's a lot of for this sort of theme is thinking about our positionality as researchers and how we as researchers play a large role in how many of these things are communicated out, and then in a very circular way, right? How people sort of perceive and understand these things then plays a part in how research questions are, formulated, right? And so a lot of I feel like a lot of my research are now sort of being like, hey, researchers, here are many ways in which we're like part of the problem. Here are some ways in which you can improve. So that's for that paper. Another paper, if people are interested, is I wrote a paper with Kate Webb and Robin Douglas, in which
Fantastic. I sent it around to the whole lab when it came out.
yeah.
I hope everyone read it.
No, I hope people found it useful, right? And so here's a little infographic for the paper. And so essentially for this one, it's a bit more narrow sort of in scope and sort of thinking about not just SES, but for so many of the studies that are sort of looking at neighborhood disadvantage, really reminding a lot of researchers that neighborhood disadvantage, again, is not just this one variable, right? That's an objective sort of variable that is couched in all of these different sorts of sociopolitical sort of aspects, and that can be related to, and in the end, it comes down to, especially in the US, structural racism in many sorts of ways, right? Which is also an interesting because it's such a politicized sort of concept now, right? And so through the paper, we try to offer some sort of operationalizations and guidance on how to implement and think about these things in research as well. And other things that I think other studies sort of say related to like, increase, open up the table to more people. How do we start sort of moving outside of the ivory tower and start to really think about how literally the rest of the world or the rest of how the people that we're actually talking about think about these concepts, not just race and ethnicity and social class, but also experiences in neighborhoods, experiences in life, right? So there's a lot I'll skip over this because it actually was covered in a lot of these papers. These are just a few sort of frameworks that we discuss in that Frontiers paper. But I do want to focus on just quickly talk about this paper by Kasia Tolwinski, which I think is a good read. She interviewed a number of neuroscience of poverty researchers and really asked them about like what it was like to conduct science and all of these things. And I think the biggest her take home was that it's hard. And you have sort of two things that are slamming into each other, and can they actually be reconciled? Who knows? One, which is the fact that these dynamics are all sort of latent, emergent properties, complex, dynamic, dependent on time, all these things, and so they're really hard to sort of measure. And how do you encapsulate that when, as researchers, as good experimental practices, we're taught to, for that perspective, be reductive, right? Like what does having a good experiment mean is, basically isolating a particular sort of element in perhaps a way that can be experimentally sort of manipulated or altered, right? Or compared and contrasted. And so these two things are kind of like the way that we're taught as scientists is to really be like, well, let's narrow it down to this one specific factor. And that factor is just, it's going to be really hard to encapsulate all these different sort of dynamics. And so it's always good. There's always going to be this tension, this sort of frustration at being able to measure things in a useful enough way, while still being true to what it actually is. So there's also another element about how a lot of these researchers approach sort of controversy and when they get critiques of their work as what she called the sort of game of whack-a-mole, where it's kind of like instead of sort of thinking about like, oh, what are the ways in which we really think about the way that we measure these things or what is constant, it really is just like, you get a list of reviews from a reviewer and you address just each one by one, right? And so, she sort of talks about like that could be sort of limiting sort of progress or sort of engagement across the field, because if you really just put a Band-Aid here, or like put a Band-Aid there, like fix on all the little things, you don't actually talk about sort of structural and systemic sort of elements that may be at play in either the system or in sort of the research sort of process. So it's like the question that you're talking about reviewers. It's like, well, there's the question about like that reviewer that will be like, oh, it's like you might get stuck sort of having to deal with someone like making you control for race and ethnicity, when like by that way, it's like sidestepping sort of that question of like, well, if we think about race and ethnicity, what role is it sort of playing here? So I like the paper a lot. I think it's a sort of good read. It is also a frustrating read because, it really is a lot of, you look at it and it's like, one of the things that she mentioned, one of the things that she mentions too is just that like, yeah, she's like, some neuroscientists resolve their frustration by making just more and more complex models, because that is making a more complex model must mean that you're doing a more responsible job. And she's like, and so she discussed about how like that may or may not be the case, right? But those are just some approaches. So I'm telling you, I could talk about this for hours, but given that I don't want to keep you guys for forever, I do want to talk to you about this sort of other side. I do data stuff too. I do data stuff too. And this is actually another sort of thing that I probably could talk for a really long time about too. And so I've talked about all these complexities, these multiple levels, hierarchical sort of element. So how do we measure sort of these things? How do you measure these environmental and structural factors, right? And I will say one thing is that there's no perfect way, right? Like it's like we can basically, like, the spoiler is we can move away from SES and race and ethnicity, these broad proxies, to move to other elements that we think may be better sort of measurements for mechanisms, but you'll always be able to be more specific, right? So it's kind of like find better proxies instead of just like these broader proxies. But talking a little bit about data and some of the things that I do. So the other body of things is thinking about these environmental exposures and doing sort of multivariate analyses on these. So again, going back to the ABCD study, one of the good things about the ABCD study, I think it's where I spend most of my time, is the fact that we, for all individuals, they provide the addresses that they live, up to 3 addresses in which they live. And so we're able to use, as best as we can, that residential information to geocode it. If we know where they live, we don't know the exact address, but but we have a process in which if we have an external sort of database of exposure or whatever that might be, we can then sort of get elements about what their neighborhood might look like without having to necessarily ask them. And so it kind of opens up a whole other world of, from a population levels of sort of element, being able to bring those elements inside. Comes with its limitations, right? You're basically getting people's neighborhoods and communities. You're not getting their individual sort of experience. But so a lot of the stuff that I sort of focus on is on sort of these external sort of data, which Andrew has heard a lot of these about because he's co-chair of that working group too. And so a lot of the measures that I sort of use are the ones here. So this is my sort of my course sort of categorization of what this looks like in ABCD. So again, using them as proxies for using them as representative sort of sociocultural sort of dynamics. We can think of demographics, but also a number of things about the social community. A lot of these things are drawn from the census. So things like language diversity, what different languages are spoken, what are the different sort of demographics of different types of groups within a neighborhood, but also thinking about sort of a toxigenic exposure. So I talked about air pollution, but also things that could be related to like extreme heat, proximity to Superfund sites, and then also just access to resources. So this could be access to educational centers, access to green space, access to healthy food. So things like food deserts and also vacant housing, and then also just other sort of neighborhood conditions like amount of crime, population density, proximity of home to roads. So we can use, so all of these are available. If you really want an overwhelming sort of figure, this is everything that is coming in the next sort of release, where we can expand sort of these domains to not just think about those compositions, but also think about other things like other structural factors like residential segregation, community health burden from different community health estimates. What are some other things? Different sort of laws and policies, different sorts of amenities and services that could actually not be, could actually be supportive, right? Like the presence of the density of like religious organizations, civic services, social services, arts organizations, sporting event locations, things like that could also be a part of this, right? And so what I try to do is in a lot of my modeling, this will pick up really fast. A lot of the modeling is very difficult because many of these variables are related, especially if we're drawing, if we think about sort of these geocoded estimates, right? Where these tend to be very coarse, and also for privacy issues, since we can't get sort of individual level data, we're kind of making approximations about communities, which could be census tract. I don't think any of them are zip code, but zip code is another way of thinking about it. Could be a county. For some of you, I think it's up to state, which starts to get a little bit broad, but still. So you have all these things that could in fact actually be correlated. And actually, if you think back to the measure that I had that was sort of hierarchical in nature, any space and place can be so important and subject to so many particular sort of state legislatures or geographical sort of things that there is a lot of sort of correlation that you could expect there. So a lot of what I use are just like data-driven sort of multivariate sort of techniques and applying that to a number of the environmental exposures that we have. So, you know, if we're thinking about just reducing a number of variables to one, thinking about principal components analysis, but then also using things like canonical correlations analysis, partial least squares analyses for things with 2 blocks, and then also for some of the work that I'm doing, expanding to multi-block PLS or generalized CCA for if the modeling that I'm trying to look at is if we're going for different sorts of blocks. And I'll explain what that looks like in a second. And we're right on the hour, so I'm going to pick up real quick. So if people don't know what PLS or canonical correlations analysis is,
We've been doing some PLS stuff with imaging data, so
okay,
we're okay. I mean, well, we can always learn more, but if you want to, for the interest of time.
yeah. So essentially, yeah. So for PLS, right? So this is just an example here of actually this might not be the best example with all the colors, but if you look at the top here, one example could be, and actually I'll show some results from here is a study where we were doing PLS to essentially try to see how different air pollution, basically different types of air pollutants, PM 2.5 or ozone or NO2 could be related to different sort of RSI or diffusion sort of metrics that we were using there. So
I like the way you conceptualize that you maximize covariance in PLS and maximize correlation in CCA. That's the clearest way I've heard that described.
Yeah, yeah, no, it's a yeah. So no, it's a we spent so much time on this figure, but essentially, yeah, you take 2 blocks, and then you take 2 blocks, and then you do SVD. We use SVD. You can do some other things too, and essentially, you get sort of these loadings. You get these latent variables, which you can basically get sort of loadings and scores on each side to basically describe different relationships between these data. So. But yeah, so it's covariance in PLS, correlations in CCA. Depending on your question, there may be sort of different. One could be appropriate, or the other, as we'll see. So I just really quickly want to show you just 3 examples of sort of the way that I've sort of taken a lot of these environmental variables in ABCD, use these different sort of multivariate sort of approaches to get some insights on different things related to either behavior and performance or brain or whatever. So the first one was in the study with Wesley Meredith, who's actually here at UCLA. He did, yeah. Yeah, he told it's okay. I talked about a lot of the things here. And so one of the things that we were doing, and this is a slight deviation from something I did for my dissertation too. This is not just think about external data, but if we think about a child's environment as sort of being related to in different categories, such as neighborhood, school environment, home environment, cultural environment, could we sort of do, basically what we did is we chose measures for each one of these sort of buckets. And if we did PCAs, could those PCAs give us sort of different sort of unique, could describe variance uniquely for cognitive function? Spoiler, they do. But so this is just one approach where we basically took, so like if you're looking at the neighborhood external data, you can sort of see it here. And so, you know, the first sort of PC is always like a general sort of disadvantage sort of disadvantaged sort of component. But by using sort of this principal component analysis, using the first PC for each one of these different categories, and then putting them in different models and seeing how they related to sociodemographics did show sort of unique contributions for depending on which measure you use. So that was one approach, looking at different environment sort of construed as a mixture of neighborhood, but also individual sort of environment. Here's another study thinking about a 2-block sort of example. So these are actually the results from a paper that's under review with Kirtana Sukumaran, who's a project specialist working in our lab. So essentially what we did here is basically we want to look at one tricky thing about air pollution is that there's a lot of exposures that are happening at one time. So we were thinking about particulate matter, 2.5, ozone, NO2. If we put them into these multivariate analyses, what can they sort of tell us about different diffusion properties in the brain? And so we got this sort of latent variable that was really robust and significant that essentially was showing right thalamus, some nucleus accumbens and some brainstem too, associated with PM 2.5. So that was just another sort of just a different approach to just using these elements. But then you can also not just think about these environmental exposures, but also think about these sort of social and environmental exposures together. And so for this last one, here's a paper that I'm working on right now that essentially is no brain images, just bars here. So essentially this is a generalized canonical correlation analysis, which essentially is 3 blocks of variables. So here it's looking at just coarse cortical brain volume. So you have brain volume, you have a number of external environmental measures, and also cognitive function. And so trying to see, can we extract latent variables that are reliable and significant from this? And so here we do get, and here canonical correlations, I use canonical correlations instead of partial least squares, because that way you also are able to sort of account for sort of global sort of differences in sort of brain volume and things like that. And so now we're, instead of just focusing on sort of like this covariation that may occur, we can now sort of account for that and sort of look at smaller, sort of more relative differences. And so here, yeah, so essentially what we see is a heterogeneous effect across the brain, which is what you're more likely to get at CCA. And again, this environmental sort of factor does kind of, is what we sort of would expect. So you can kind of just see, so it's really small and it's hard to see, but essentially, if we think of the right as positive and left as negative, you see a lot of these variables related to like high socioeconomic status or better sort of conditions being associated with better household income, and that all of that being related to higher cognitive scores. Now, one thing, so another thing about this one, and this is where I've been stuck sort of writing this. And so for this analysis, so as we sort of think about all these environmental sort of features, I was also interested to see if I also threw in self-reported sociodemographics, how those would look like. And so those loadings here are actually stronger. So even though there are all these, so the top 4 here are a dummy variable for Black, a dummy variable for white, and then highest education, highest income. And so as you sort of throw in there, even if you think about these sociodemographics, they still have a stronger relationship to the environmental variables, which is kind of what we would sort of predict, given that, if we sort of think about sort of the race and ethnicity variables and the SES variables sort of being at the most upstream, then they sort of impact everything down below. And so one thing about this though is that this comes up a lot, and so the first latent variable that we see is always sort of this sort of general sort of disadvantage sort of variable. So it's like, great, you look at this and you're like, okay, structural racism and systemic racism exist. Okay, check. And so what I was trying to explore for this analysis is actually going a step further than that and going, okay, well, we know that. Now, in terms of thinking about more precise implementations or follow-ups, I decided to run these models, given that the strongest loading were for the Black and white groups, actually trying to rerun these analyses sort of within group. And so, so here for this next figure, I'm just going to show you the brain, the environment and the brain volume. And I'm not, on purpose, I'm not going to tell you which one is Black and which one is white. But essentially, this is the for the first group, basically the loadings for the environment and the brain volumes, and for group 2, the environment and brain volumes here. And so it's really hard to read because there's a lot of variables in this analysis, but hopefully what you can appreciate and see is that the loading pattern for the brain measures are very, very different. It's very, very different for the two groups. There's some sort of like rank change in sort of the environmental variables, but they kind of do sort of follow the rank changes slightly, but you still kind of see the similar sort of like SES sort of like affluence and disadvantage sort of elements that you might see. But there are some slight variations, right, in the sort of the rank ordering of these. But yeah, I think what was most striking to me is sort of like the fact that the brain volume profiles are very different, and not just between one group and the other, but if, and you can't see it all here, but if basically the profiles for each of these two groups is also very different from the brain volume sort of structure that we see here. And so that's where I'm sort of, and it's tricky because I think where I'm stuck with this paper is how do you communicate this while completely avoiding the whole like, oh, well, you know, like Black brains are inferior, right? In that sort of way. And so, but getting there. But I think one thing to appreciate from this analysis is just that, I mean, obviously, so measuring sort of general sort of structural disadvantage is one sort of process, but if race and ethnicity are actually of interest, then it actually makes more sense. Actually, to get what you want would actually be to do a within group sort of analysis to look at the dynamics therein. But of course, with this, needing a strong sort of theoretical sort of framing and background to be able to properly embed those within the data. So 3 examples of ways that I'm using these data and these sort of multivariate analyses for these. There are other things that I'm working on. So another way that I'm trying to work on now, we just got a pilot grant funded by NIMHD to look at some of these things in our department. But another thing, so instead of just looking at like, if we know that there are racial gaps in cognitive performance, then we can use things like Oaxaca blinder decompositions, so what you're modeling here is what you can basically do is you can decompose sort of if you have 2 groups and you have like a gap in performance, you can basically look to see what is how much of that gap is attributed to like the between group differences, but how much can be explained by the difference in coefficients of those variables within the groups. So I think that's a slightly different way of sort of, so Oaxaca blinder decompositions were initially used for gender wage gap sort of studies where, you know, to evaluate the gender wage gap, you also have to take into account that educational attainment ranges are not going to be the same between different sort of genders. And so, and then, you know, again, incorporating more of these household factors. And also part of this, and then also part of this pilot grant is also thinking about what are some moderating effects or mitigating effects that may be at play here. If we just think of environmental factors, what are some individual level factors that could be useful? And so definitely looking at like familism and acculturation in adolescents from immigrant families and how support or social dynamics within the family or the community could sort of interact with sort of these environmental exposures. So. Yeah, that was a lot. And then, of course, I have like a million people to thank for all of this. Megan, who's awesome and amazing. She's actually in Hawaii in vacation for like a week and a half. So like, good for her. And also, you know, all these places that gave me money, which is great. And also, you know, also I would talk about this in lunch or other things like that, but also I've been part of a lot of sort of groups sort of thinking about community, diversity, equity, and inclusion that have been funded by a number of these institutes that have been really helpful in workshopping and thinking about these things too. So
Wow, thank you. So maybe I will ask if there's questions from the Zoom, and then the rest of us can ask over lunch so that we can feed you before.
yeah.
So are there any Zoom questions that we can get to first, and then we'll ask our in-person questions in person. Andrew looks like he's got a question. Nothing for me. Oh. Anyone else over there in Zoom, if you can still hear us? A lot to think about.
No questions.
Yeah, if you're taking time to type in the chat, that's fine too. Or if we have any in-person questions, that's fine too.
Yeah, if people have any questions or interested in any of the like citations or anything, happy to send those along as well. I can also send my slides if that's useful for people.
Oh, yeah, I think people would be interested in taking a look after. Well, I would like to have time to take you over to Westwood and chat more over lunch. So if that's okay with people on Zoom, we'll do that, and we'll see you all next time. All right, thanks.
Bye, everyone.
Great. Yeah, okay, so just to like get us on the move, I'm gonna
Yeah,
this all
that's-
down, and then, I mean, we'll have plenty of time. I just didn't want us to get caught up here with